Bailey was no ordinary dog. She was a spirited Border Collie with boundless energy, loyalty, and intelligence that brought endless joy to her family. The Greens. Every day she'd play in their yard, her black and white coat shining as she chased sticks and guarded her family with loving devotion. Lucy Green, a young girl with an infectious laugh, was Bailey's best friend. They were inseparable, and each day they'd play games only they understood, filling the air with Lucy's giggles and Bailey's happy barks. But the Green's life took a sudden turn when Mr. Green got a job offer in a distant state. The family's joy at the opportunity was tempered by the weight of leaving behind their familiar life and the home they had loved for years. They packed boxes, saying goodbyes to neighbors and friends. Bailey was part of their plan, of course. There was no question that she would join them on this new journey. But as moving day came, with bags and boxes cluttering the house and cars loaded with their belongings, chaos struck. Bailey, always alert to anything new, had slipped out the door, her eyes fixed on a squirrel scampering across the yard. No one saw her slip out. They were too busy loading the car. In the rush, everyone assumed she was already settled in with the other belongings. And so, with hearts full of excitement and their minds occupied by the miles ahead, the Greens pulled away. By the time they realized Bailey wasn't with them, they were far along the highway, out of reach to turn back. Mr. and Mrs. Green were devastated, calling friends, neighbors, and even the local animal shelter, hoping someone would find her and keep her safe until they could return. But Bailey, their faithful dog, was nowhere to be found. Back in Willowbrook, Bailey waited. She returned to the house, trotting to the front porch and barking at the empty driveway. She paced the front yard, her keen ears twitching at every sound, listening for the familiar rumble of her family's car. When night fell, she curled up on the porch, her head resting on her paws, her eyes fixed on the street, watching and waiting for the people who had been her entire world. The first days were filled with confusion and hope. Bailey explored the neighborhood, searching for any sign of her family. Her spirit, once bright with energy and joy, became subdued. Neighbors watched her from their windows, murmuring about the loyal dog who had been left behind. Some left food by the porch, others tried to bring her into their homes. But Bailey's loyalty kept her rooted in place. She belonged to the Greens, and until they returned, this was her home. Weeks turned into months, and Bailey's once shiny coat began to lose its luster. She had become a part of Willowbrook's quiet backdrop, her loyal vigil creating a sense of mystery and sadness in the hearts of everyone who saw her. She remained a figure of unyielding hope, her head often turned toward the road, her eyes scanning for any sign of her family. In time, neighbors grew accustomed to her presence. An elderly lady named Mrs. Darrow, who lived just a few houses down, took a particular liking to Bailey. Each morning, she would bring Bailey a fresh bowl of food and water, softly speaking to her, sharing bits of her own life with the dog who seemed to understand without words. Mrs. Darrow would sit with Bailey on cold mornings, stroking her fur and murmuring words of comfort. The townspeople, captivated by Bailey's resilience, began to call her the dog that waits. Her story spread throughout Willowbrook, and children would visit to catch a glimpse of her, the loyal dog who refused to leave. People tried to bring her toys, collars, and even leashes, hoping to coax her into a new home. But Bailey wouldn't budge. She was bound to the memory of her family, a steadfast guardian of the place she'd known as home. 3 years passed. The seasons changed, each one adding its own trials to Bailey's life. Winter's cold gnawed at her bones. Summer's heat left her panting, but still, she waited. Her once sleek coat had grown ragged, her eyes still deep with longing. Then, one autumn day, a boy approached her as she lay on the porch, her head on her paws, her spirit heavy with the years of waiting. "Hey there, girl," he said gently, his voice soft and hesitant. The boy's name was Ethan, and he had just moved to Willowbrook with his mother. They were making a fresh start after a difficult time, trying to piece their lives back together in this new town. Ethan, a quiet and thoughtful boy, had heard the story of the waiting dog from neighbors. He had been drawn to her instantly, sensing a kindred spirit in the dog who, like him, seemed to be carrying the weight of a lost past. Each day after school, Ethan began to visit Bailey, sitting quietly beside her on the porch. At first, he'd bring her a scrap of food or a gentle pat, expecting nothing in return. Bailey, cautious and reserved, would glance at him but kept her gaze fixed on the street. But over time, as Ethan's visits became part of her routine, she allowed him a place in her world. Ethan would talk to Bailey in a low, comforting voice, sharing details of his life, stories of his old friends, and the memories he held of his father who had passed away. Bailey listened, her head resting on her paws, her gaze softening as she began to find comfort in his presence. She'd nudge him with her nose occasionally, a small but sincere sign of the trust she was beginning to place in him. One cold evening, Ethan brought his sleeping bag and lay beside Bailey on the porch, his hand resting on her rough fur. Together, they stared out at the street, their silent companionship speaking volumes. That night, under the cover of stars, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He and Bailey, in their quiet way, were each other's solace. Ethan's mother, watching from a distance, felt a pang of both pride and sadness. She saw how much Bailey meant to Ethan, the way the dog's silent strength had given him comfort, and yet she couldn't bear to watch her son's heart grow more attached to a dog who was waiting for someone else. As much as Ethan wanted to be there for Bailey, he also longed to give her what she truly wanted, to be reunited with her family. One autumn afternoon, Ethan sat beside Bailey, gently petting her ear. "I'll help you, Bailey," he whispered, the determination clear in his voice. "I'll find them for you." Bailey's eyes met his, her gentle nudge against his hand, expressing her silent gratitude. With that promise, Ethan's mission took shape. He was resolved to find the greens and bring them back to the dog who had waited for them so faithfully. In the days that followed, Ethan began to ask the townspeople questions, hoping someone would have information about the greens. Some offered fragments of a story, while others could only shrug with uncertainty. They recalled bits and pieces, a family that was kind, who had left quickly and mysteriously, always attentive to Bailey, but no one knew where they had gone. Ethan's determination deepened. He realized that if he was going to find Bailey's family, he would need to dig deeper. Ethan knew he needed to try harder if he was going to find Bailey's family. So on a rainy Saturday, he and his mother made their way to the Willowbrook Library, where he hoped to dig up any trace of the greens. Ms. Perkins, the librarian, had heard Bailey's story and welcomed Ethan's search with a warm smile. She brought him stacks of old town records and newspapers, saying, "Sometimes the smallest clues can open the biggest doors." Ethan pored over the clippings, his fingers tracing faded words as he hunted for anything mentioning the greens. He found a few articles that mentioned them, community events, a bake sale, and even a dog show where Bailey had proudly won a ribbon with Lucy at her side. Seeing Bailey, young and full of life, in those photographs brought a bittersweet smile to his face. He could imagine her then, playing and running, her whole world revolving around her family. But then, one article stood out. It was a small piece, buried in the back pages, mentioning a car accident involving a vehicle that matched the Greens' description. The details were sparse, but it explained that they had been taken to a hospital in the next town, and shortly after, they had relocated due to family circumstances. Ethan's heart sank. It was hard to imagine the confusion and pain the family must have felt in those days. His mother, who had been reading over his shoulder, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "They probably thought she'd be safe here, Ethan. Maybe they just didn't know where she was." But Ethan was already planning his next step. He had to find them. He couldn't let Bailey's wait be in vain. He worked up the courage to share his findings with a few neighbors, many of whom had grown fond of Bailey over the years. As word of his search spread, neighbors and townspeople began to offer help. Donations poured in for Ethan's mission, small amounts here and there, enough to cover travel costs and allow him to keep up the search without delay. Finally, with the funds they needed, Ethan and his mother packed up for a weekend trip to visit the nearby town and the address they'd uncovered from the old records. They drove for hours, winding through open roads and quiet neighborhoods. The autumn leaves a swirl of red and gold outside the window. Bailey sat in the back seat, her tired eyes gazing out at the passing trees, unaware of the journey they were taking for her. They finally arrived at an apartment complex, its paint faded and walkway cracked. It was a modest place, nestled in a quiet corner of town, but Ethan was filled with hope. He took Bailey's old photo from his pocket and began asking neighbors if they recognized her or knew the family. At first, people could only offer sympathetic shakes of their heads, but finally, an elderly man recalled seeing a family with a young girl and a friendly dog. "They didn't stay long," he said. "Moved north, I think. It's been years since I've seen them." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan and his mother thanked the man and returned to the car. Though exhausted, Bailey still nudged Ethan's arm, her gentle brown eyes giving him the strength to keep going. Over the next few days, they expanded their search, reaching out to shelters and online communities, sharing Bailey's story along with a picture of her hopeful eyes, calling her the forgotten dog of Willowbrook. They explained that she'd been waiting for her family to return, and they asked if anyone had any information about the Greens. The response was overwhelming. People from nearby towns began sharing Bailey's story, touched by the dog's unbreakable loyalty. And as her story traveled, it found its way to distant relatives of the Greens. One afternoon, a message arrived from a man named Tom, a cousin of the Greens who had seen the post online. He hadn't been in touch with them in years, but had an address for a family member who might know where they were. With this new information, Ethan's hope soared. He shared the update with his mother and the librarian, who offered to help with any remaining research. With his mother's encouragement, Ethan prepared to reach out to the Greens family member. "I just hope it's enough," he whispered to Bailey one night, resting his hand on her weary frame. "I promise we'll keep trying." Bailey responded with a soft, tired bark, as if to reassure him that she was grateful, that the journey they were on was one she had always hoped for. A few days later, just as Ethan was beginning to lose hope, his mother received a call. She answered it, her voice soft but tense. On the other end was a young woman's voice, hesitant yet filled with emotion. It was Lucy Green, now grown up and in college, who had seen the story shared online. Her voice trembled as she explained to Ethan's mother how she had never forgotten Bailey, and that her family had searched and hoped to find her for years. When Ethan's mother handed him the phone, he struggled to hold back his own emotions as he heard Lucy speak. She was overwhelmed by the idea that Bailey was still waiting for them. "We tried so hard to find her," Lucy said, her voice cracking. "It's like a dream. I can't believe she's still there, waiting." In that moment, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. He listened as Lucy told him that her family was planning to visit Willowbrook as soon as possible. They wanted nothing more than to see Bailey, to hold her close and let her know that they had never forgotten her. The day of the reunion was set, and Ethan spent every free moment with Bailey, whispering words of reassurance, telling her that her long wait was nearly over. Though her fur was ragged and her steps slow, Bailey's eyes held a spark that had been dimmed for so long. She seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen. On the morning of the reunion, Ethan sat on the porch steps beside her, watching as the sun cast its golden light over the town. Bailey, too, seemed to sense the significance of the day. Her head raised and ears perked as if she were a younger dog again, ready to run and play. And then a car appeared in the distance, moving slowly down the street. Ethan held his breath, his heart racing as he recognized the Greens stepping out. Lucy was the first to see Bailey, and her eyes filled with tears as she took a tentative step forward, calling out softly, "Bailey, it's me. It's Lucy." Bailey's head shot up, and for a split second, she hesitated, as if her old heart were trying to catch up with the rush of emotions flooding her senses. Then, with a burst of energy that defied her years, Bailey ran toward Lucy, her tail wagging furiously, her bark filled with joy and relief. Lucy dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around Bailey, whispering words of love and apologies into her fur. Mr. and Mrs. Green joined them, kneeling to pet their loyal dog, who had waited for them through every season, through rain and sun, through loss and hope. Ethan watched the reunion, a bittersweet smile on his face, knowing he had been a part of something extraordinary. He had helped a loyal friend reunite with the family she loved, and though he felt a pang of sadness, he knew that Bailey was exactly where she was meant to be. Bailey whimpered with joy, her old body pressed against the family she had waited so long to see. She licked their faces, her eyes bright with the happiness of a dog who had finally found her way back home. The days following Bailey's reunion with the Greens were filled with happiness and heartfelt farewells. The townspeople, who had grown so accustomed to Bailey's presence, gathered one last time to say goodbye. They brought treats, toys, and flowers, sharing quiet moments with the dog who had waited through the seasons, inspiring them all. Mrs. Darrow, who had cared for Bailey during her long wait, knelt down beside her, tears glistening in her eyes. "You were always a good girl, Bailey," she whispered, gently stroking her fur. Bailey nudged Mrs. Darrow's hand, her silent way of saying thank you for all the kindness she'd been shown. On their final evening in Willowbrook, the Greens invited Ethan and his mother over, wanting to thank them for their role in reuniting their family. They shared stories of Bailey from years past, memories of the joy she had brought into their lives. Lucy, with tears in her eyes, hugged Ethan tightly. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," she whispered. "Bailey's been my best friend since I was a little girl. I thought I'd lost her forever." Ethan, his voice soft with emotion, replied, "I think she waited just as long to see you again. She never gave up." His words resonated with everyone present, the depth of Bailey's loyalty something that touched them all deeply. As the Greens prepared to leave town, Ethan sat with Bailey on the porch steps, saying his own quiet goodbye. He gently stroked her aging fur, his heart heavy yet filled with a sense of peace. "I'll miss you, Bailey," he murmured. "You'll always be my friend." Bailey leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, as if she understood. She had been given the gift of a second chance, and though it was bittersweet to leave, She was finally going home with the people she loved. The next morning, the townspeople gathered once more as the Greens' car pulled out of the driveway. Bailey looked out the back window, her eyes meeting Ethan's one last time, a small bark escaping her lips as if to say goodbye. The car disappeared down the road, and Ethan watched until he could see it no longer, knowing that Bailey's spirit would always remain with him. After Bailey left, the town felt different. The porch where she had waited was quiet, the space she had once filled with her gentle presence, now a place of remembrance. To honor Bailey's unwavering loyalty, the townspeople placed a small plaque on the porch, engraved with the words, "Here waited Bailey, a dog whose loyalty knew no bounds. May her story remind us all of the strength of hope and love." Ethan would often pass by the porch on his way home from school, pausing to read the plaque, feeling Bailey's presence still lingering there. Her story became a part of Willowbrook's history, shared with visitors and newcomers, a reminder of the quiet strength that loyalty could inspire. One day, as he read the plaque, Ethan felt a deep urge to do something more. He missed Bailey terribly, but he wanted to honor her memory in a way that would help other animals. He approached his mother with an idea that had taken root in his heart. "I want to help other dogs like Bailey," he said. "Dogs who need a home, who are waiting for a family." His mother, touched by his resolve, encouraged him wholeheartedly. And so, with her help and the support of the townspeople, Ethan started a small organization dedicated to helping abandoned pets find homes. He named it Bailey's Hope, in memory of the dog who had taught him the power of love and loyalty. Through Bailey's Hope, Ethan began organizing adoption fairs, connecting local shelters, and raising awareness about the importance of giving animals a second chance. The town embraced his mission, rallying around his cause with a generosity inspired by Bailey's story. Ms. Perkins, the librarian, helped create posters. Mrs. Darrow donated blankets, and other townsfolk offered food, supplies, and even foster homes. Ethan spent countless weekends visiting shelters, getting to know the animals, learning their stories, and doing everything he could to find them loving families. Each dog and cat he helped find a home was, in his mind, a tribute to Bailey, and each adoption felt like a small piece of her legacy, spreading love and compassion far beyond Willowbrook. One chilly autumn afternoon, as Ethan was preparing for an adoption fair, a young girl approached him. She held a stuffed dog in her arms, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and shyness. "Do you think any of these dogs would wait for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan knelt down beside her, smiling. "I think every dog here would be lucky to have someone like you, and if you love them, they'll stay by your side forever." Moved by his words, the girl chose a small, shy puppy who had been waiting for a home for months. She named him Lucky, and as they left together, Ethan felt a swell of pride. He knew Bailey's spirit lived on in every new bond formed, every family united with a waiting animal.